When faced with a moral issue, we all want to come to the correct response. But what questions should we ask ourselves in order to achieve a good moral outcome? Should we concentrate on doing our duty, or is it important to consider the consequences of the act that we're about to carry out? That's going to be the driving question of today's lesson. To answer it, we're going to look at two radically different responses. There are two major types of ethical system, those that are deontological or duty-based, and those that are consequentialist. We're going to define those and evaluate their respective strengths and weaknesses. This is a definition of deontology. It's the belief that actions are moral if they follow pre-established moral rules, and being a good person is about doing your duty regardless of the consequences. To illustrate that, let's look at a couple of examples. I begin with the story of Dirk Willems. The images on the screen are of baptism, one an infant baptism and the other an adult baptism. In the modern world, this isn't a controversial slide, but going back a few hundred years it certainly was. Dirk Willems was an Anabaptist in the Netherlands. He believed that infant baptism was immoral. One of the reasons being that the children who were being baptised could not understand the significance of the ritual they were engaging in, and therefore that robbed it of any importance. This did not sit well with the religious authorities at the time, who believed in original sin, and so Dirk Willems' views were heretical. He was arrested, imprisoned, and sentenced to death. He was to be burnt at the stake. Knowing that this was his future, he managed to escape. He ran out of the castle that he was being held in, and because he was so malnourished, he managed to run across the moat which had frozen over. His pursuer, a guard, tried to follow him, but the ice cracked and the guard fell into the moat. Dirk Willems was faced with a choice. He could run to freedom and save his own life, or he could try and rescue the man who was chasing after him. Believing that Christianity compelled him to love his enemies and to protect life, he turned back and he helped the guard out, who promptly arrested him, and Dirk Willems was ultimately burnt at the stake. He died in order to save the life of the person who was going to kill him. This is an act of a moral absolutist. Dirk Willems believed that it was morally right to save someone's life, regardless of the consequences, regardless of what happened to him as a result. He followed the rules. He did his duty as a Christian, even though it led to his painful death. Many consider Dirk Willems to be a moral hero, but that's not to say that deontology, following rules, is without its ethical problems. This is a classic case. Imagine that you know the whereabouts of Anne Frank. This is her house, the house that she hid in almost successfully from the Nazis for several years. And this is the bookcase that hid her attic that she lived in with her family and some friends. Imagine that you know all this, and the Gestapo come to the door one day, and they ask you, is there a Jewish family living in a hidden attic upstairs? What would your answer be? If you're a moral absolutist, let's say you're a Christian, just like Dirk Willems, your answer is going to be, yes, the family's upstairs. You're going to tell the truth, because you're not allowed to tell a lie. It's clearly in the Bible, thou shalt not lie. The moral rule exists, and it's applicable in all places, at all times. You are responsible for your moral actions. So when you look at the Gestapo officer, you are compelled to follow the moral rule. You tell them where Anne Frank is hiding. Cardinal Newman, hugely influential British Roman Catholic thinker, said, "It were better for sun and moon to drop from heaven, for the earth to fail, and for all the many millions who are upon it to die of starvation in extremest agony, so far as temporal affliction goes, than that one soul, I will not say should be lost, but should commit one single venial, which means forgivable, sin, should tell one wilful untruth, though it harmed no one." Newman is saying here, it's better for everyone to die in agony than for someone to commit a single sin. That is how moral absolutists think. The consequences, they're not morally relevant. You have to think about intention. You have to think about the moral rule. You have to do what the rule says, regardless of the outcome. Sometimes that is heroic, like Dirk Willems, and sometimes it seems completely immoral, like telling the Nazis where Anne Frank is hidden. Deontology does provide moral certainty. There are rules and they apply in all places and at all times. And it condemns some acts as right and some as wrong, and that provides stability. And it judges actions on intention rather than consequence, and that seems important. If someone accidentally stands on your foot, that's totally different to if they did it on purpose, even though the consequence, your foot hurts, is the same. For those reasons, deontology seems sound. But it's inflexible and it's absolutist, and we've seen the problems with moral absolutism in the previous lesson. And it can be very difficult to reconcile conflicting duties. You have a duty to tell the truth, but you also surely have a moral duty to help protect Anne Frank's life. And following deontological ethics can make the world a worse place. The death of an innocent schoolgirl rather than telling a lie. I mean, it seems appalling. Just break the rule, tell a lie. By following moral absolutism, you are making the world a worse place. And that seems to be a massive problem with any ethical theory. Therefore, there is a competing idea called consequentialism. And this states that an act is right or wrong based on the results of that act. The more good consequences an act produces, the better or more right that act is. I would look at this passage by Cardinal Newman and say, come on, what absolute nonsense. It would also look at the story of Dirk Willems and say, yeah, it's nice that he stopped and saved his pursuer's life, but he had no moral compunction to do that. He was right to consider the consequences. When he looked out over the Dutch countryside, he could have made the evaluation that he was being unfairly sentenced to death simply for expressing what we would now consider a fairly innocuous view about baptism. And he was right to run away. His jailer was jailing him for a rubbish reason, and his right to life trumped the jailer's. Even more powerfully in favour of consequentialism, let's again look at the Anne Frank situation. Surely we would want a moral consequentialist to answer the door. Yes, the consequentialist would say, not lying is usually a fairly good rule. That usually leads to good consequences. Telling the truth is usually good. But it is usually good not to lie because of the consequences, not because lying is eternally morally wrong. In this situation, lie to the Gestapo officer. The Gestapo officer is evil. By lying, you protect a life, an innocent life, several innocent lives. Of course you should look at the consequences. The consequences here massively outweigh any vague notion that one should never ever tell a lie. Consequentialism then is flexible, and it can lead to a genuinely better world, as the Anne Frank situation clearly demonstrates. However, there are massive problems with consequentialism. Predicting consequences is almost impossible. How do we know what's going to happen in the future? As is weighing up which consequence is better than another consequence. It also ignores intention, and that can't be right. And it can allow horrendous acts and be inconsistent with human rights because there are no absolute moral laws in which you have to follow. You simply need to think about the consequences. So it might be right in that particular instance to kill an innocent person if the consequences are going to be good. Now, the first criticism there, that predicting consequences is almost impossible, is something that we need to elaborate a little bit more on and give you 3 examples. First, rabbits in Australia. Rabbits aren't indigenous animals in Australia. They aren't native there. We introduced them. By we, I mean the British. In particular, Thomas Austin, who in 1859 brought 24 wild rabbits to his garden in the state of Victoria so that he could shoot them, because that seemed like a fun thing to do to him and it would remind him of home. And he recorded in his diary what harm could it do. It turned out a lot of harm. Within 10 years, 2 million rabbits could be shot or trapped annually without it having any noticeable effect on the population. It was the fastest spread of any mammal in history. The rabbits ate away the grass which was holding the topsoil on, and therefore the strong winds that can occur in Australia blew the topsoil away. This utterly destroyed a very fragile ecosystem, decimated farming land, and led to famine. One of the advantages, though, I suppose, is that there were so many rabbits left over that they could eat them, and that helped some people survive the famine. This is probably one of the most devastating ecological disasters in recorded history, and it was all because one Englishman wanted to shoot a few rabbits. He could not have foreseen those consequences, but they occurred. Another example of this is known as the Streisand effect. Now, Barbra Streisand has had a career spanning 60 years. She sold 250 million records. But she will probably go down in history as the person behind the Streisand effect. The image that you can see here is of her house. Now, a series of photographs were taken of the Malibu coastline where she lives, and these photographs were uploaded onto the internet. She found this to be an invasion of her privacy, and so sued the photographer for $50 million. She ultimately lost this case. At the time of her launching her legal action to protect her privacy, that image had been downloaded 4 times. By the end of the month in which her lawsuit was filed, it had been viewed 450,000 times. Her attempt to preserve her privacy had exactly the opposite consequence. Another example is the Peltzman effect. This was a claim made a few years ago that all the advancements that we've made in protecting road users and drivers were consumed by those drivers who began to drive in a more dangerous way. It's quite a controversial investigation, but it does seem to have some basis in fact. You can see in the image on the left there how cars respond when they have anti-lock braking and when they don't have anti-lock braking. Without anti-lock braking, you emergency brake and the car takes much longer to stop and skids out of control and can go in a variety of different directions. With ABS, it's a much quicker brake and much safer. You stay in one direction. In Germany, a study was carried out where 2 sets of taxis were exactly the same, apart from one was fitted with ABS and the other wasn't. At the end of the study, there had been more accidents with ABS than without, because those drivers felt overconfident in ABS's power to get them out of a difficult situation, and so they drove quicker and more dangerously. A similar study, although again controversial, has found that those skiers who use helmets generally adopt riskier practices because they feel safer. And so wearing a helmet can actually make you more at risk than not wearing it. Likewise, a study has found that if a driver sees a cyclist wearing a helmet, they tend to overtake that cyclist much closer because they think the cyclist is safe. When they see a cyclist without a helmet, they think, oh, this is very risky, I don't want to clip that cyclist, it could kill them. So actually it's safer, some would argue, for the cyclist not to have the helmet than to have a helmet. The Peltzman effect, therefore, says that all the measures we take to increase safety are simply consumed by riskier behaviour. We end up having a nil effect. So if we encourage people to wear cycling helmets or to have ABS fitted to their cars, they will just end up driving quicker or cycling more dangerously or having other people underestimate how risky it is to overtake them. Therefore, the central premise of consequentialism, that we can predict consequences and consequences will determine whether a moral action is right or wrong, seems to be dubious. So, we're left with the fundamental question, are you a consequentialist or a deontologist? Both have strengths, both have weaknesses. It's up to you to decide.